Well, good morning to you who are here today and to all the people who are following via the live stream. You might have noticed that there is a little difference in the frame, in the setting today, because today we start a series of guest speakers on seeing the Eucharist. So before I say more about actually the topic of the talk today, I invite you all to get a copy of the program for the year. The people who are online have been sent a PDF with the, all the lectures, talks, classes, reading groups we're going to have this coming year. And you will see that the lectures and the talks and the reading groups are all organized around the two major theological lectures of the year. The Hobart lecture we had last week, and the spring lecture we are going to have in May, I think, or April or May, with William, oh dear, now the name escapes me, so if you that's typical, William Cavanaugh, who is a theologian who has written extensively about the Eucharist and idolatry. So the idea is to spend most of this year thinking about idolatry and the Eucharist, or rather the Eucharist as an antidote to idolatry in all its forms. But we are going to explore also the meaning and the various aspects of the Eucharist. And then this is the year in which in church we read the Gospel of Matthew, so we are going to explore also the Gospel of Matthew. And there is a whole section on art and spirituality, so the Gospel of Matthew in Caravaggio. Then we are going to have a guided tour of the MoMA Museum. Then we are going to also start a series on exploring the Episcopal churches in New York and the architecture of those churches, and many other things. In the section on art and spirituality, we have this series, Seeing the Eucharist, with two guests who also happen to be very, very good friends of St. Thomas. So you have the whole series, the titles of the lectures, the talks, and the speakers in the brochure. And today I'm just going to introduce the first talk and the speaker, so Felicity Harley-McGowan. We are very, very pleased that you came. And we know you also because Andrew, your husband, who is here today as well, has been giving us a number of lectures on the history of the Book of Common Prayer last year, which really appreciated and loved. So Felicity is a lecturer in Christianity and the arts at the Yale Divinity School. Her research focuses on early Christian and medieval art, with particular attention to the origins of Christian iconography and the visual culture of martyrdom and salvation. She has published widely on the relationship between art and theology, and is a leading voice in exploring how visual imagery shapes Christian devotion and belief. So she will talk about the communion of the apostles based on a miniature in the Saint Augustine Gospels, a 6th century illuminated manuscript. So we are very happy to have you, Felicity.
Thank you.
Up to you.
Thank you. Well, it's lovely to be here and to be the first in this very rich program that you are going to have, thinking about the Eucharist and looking at images of the Eucharist. And as Father Luigi mentioned, I'm very interested in the beginnings of Christian art, and so today I want to take us to one of the earliest images that we have that survives of the Last Supper, but also within that image some reference to the Eucharist, and thinking about the ways in which the representation visually of the Eucharist in art, which becomes very popular during the medieval period, stems, of course, from this understanding that you will discuss in different contexts in the parish about the institution of the Eucharist in the Last Supper. So that takes me to the question. This is the miniature that I am going to speak to you about today. the question of when the Eucharist becomes a subject of interest in visual representation, that question is connected to when Christians begin to become interested in the episode of the Last Supper. And it's relatively rare to find, before the 6th century, any representations of the Last Supper. In the 4th and 5th centuries, we begin to, in the earliest surviving Christian art, have cycles of episodes that refer to scenes or stories from the life of Christ. And by the 4th century, some episodes referring specifically to the Passion. But the sense of a cycle of images that cover the life of Christ, his ministry, performance of miracles, and then the stages across from the Last Supper through to his trial, execution, and resurrection. We don't have cycles that explore that development really until the 6th century. We have some smaller cycles that survive from the 5th century, but as a seamless sort of visual exploration of the life of Christ, we don't have many examples of art being used as a way of recalling those different episodes in the ways that we have, for example, in liturgical celebrations by that date. So the miniature that I'm going to speak about, which may look a little humble to you at this point, particularly if you've seen the exhibition currently on at the Morgan Library about the Psalms and medieval manuscripts. If you haven't been to see that, highly recommend it. It's an exquisite exhibition, but very helpful in thinking about the relationship between text and image. Those manuscripts and those that we tend to associate with medieval culture are vibrantly illuminated, a lot of gold and quite vibrantly coloured pigments. And the miniature that you see here that I'll show you in the page in which it is found in a moment, we have just very delicate pen lines and washes of colour. So it doesn't present as being an extraordinary visual experience, but I'm going to suggest that that's absolutely what it is. It's one of my favourite, the book in which it's found is one of my favourite objects, and so I want to talk to you a little about the book before I then talk in a little more detail about the page in which the miniature is found. The book, I know that some of you here have heard about the history of this book. This is a gospel book that is now in the Corpus Christi College at the University of Cambridge, but came from Rome at some point in the 7th century to England. There is enough evidence for us to feel very confident about the fact that it's one of the books that Pope Gregory the Great sent with one of his monks, Augustine, as part of a mission from Gregory to England to evangelize in England. So Augustine went with a group of monks equipped with a range of liturgical objects, and we know from the historian Bede that the monks also took books. And this gospel book is believed to be among one of the books that were taken. We know from the handwriting that I'll show you a detail of in a moment. Scholars, according to the handwriting, or paleography as we call it, have secured a production date or a production location in the city of Rome. So it's possible / likely that it was produced in the scriptorium in the monastery connected to Gregory the Great in Rome, and that therefore the images that are also contained in the book were produced in Rome in the 6th century as well. So it has a very important history that I'll say a little bit more about in terms of its connection with the history of Christianity and the role of art in evangelizing. And the miniatures that are contained in the book, which are, there were originally at least 7 full-page illuminations within the book. Only 2 survive. We know that other pages existed within the book because of rubbings from where the colours were on the page, on the back of other pages. So we likely had 4 miniatures of each evangelist, but also a series of pages that illustrated aspects of Christ's life. And my comment before to you about how relatively rare, detailed visual representations of the life of Christ are before the 6th century, this manuscript is extremely important for us understanding the ways in which art became an integral part of not just illustrating. I'm going to refrain from trying to use that word, which I might explain a little more later. Not just illustrating particular episodes, but interpreting the life of Christ through art. And so the book is an extremely important piece of evidence for us in understanding the way, particularly Pope Gregory the Great, who was a great evangelist, if I can use that word, for the role of art in teaching about Christianity. The book demonstrates the ways in which people were thinking about art, not just as something that was beautifying objects or places, but had an integral role in teaching about the content of the Christian teachings. So this page, as you see here, this is one of probably 3 full pages that originally illustrated the life of Christ from the beginning to the end, but this being in the middle. So we have a series of scenes that you may not be able to see as closely on the screen, but perhaps you can see more on your handout, beginning with the entry into Jerusalem, and you can see the location of the Last Supper miniature that I'm going to speak about, right at the top register in the center. So it has enormous prominence on the page that I'll speak a little bit more about. But these delicate scenes that follow through the arrest and the trial of Christ, and finishing here with the carrying of the cross. So the next page that is lost, we assume completed that cycle, including a crucifixion and resurrection scenes. So this is the context of the miniature, both in terms physically of where it is in the book, but also historically. This is a really radical moment in the history of Christianity for understanding the ways in which art was integral to teaching about Christian faith, the life of Christ, and also, therefore, the importance of those events for salvation, if you like, for Christians. So the book itself, as I mentioned, was believed to have been given by Pope Gregory among a range of objects that a group of Gregory's monks, including Augustine, took on this journey to England as part of an evangelization process there. And the books themselves, and this is the inside of the Gospel book. This is the other single illuminated page that survives, with an author portrait of St. Luke. This is very common in Gospel books across the medieval period, but this is a very early example of the ways in which portraits of the evangelists are incorporated into the Gospel book, and modeling them, the evangelists, on portrait styles for writers that were common in the ancient world. The idea of a scribe seated at a desk, or seated with a scroll or a book in the act of writing. So Christians are adopting that very strong visual model to say something about the role of the evangelist. So this gives you a nice sense of the layout of the book. And we know it was in Canterbury Cathedral, or in the Abbey, I should say, of Saint Augustine from an early point, because there are inscriptions or captions on the images that I'll refer to later. So we know, in a different handwriting, we know that people were interacting with the book in England by the 7th and 8th century. And we have from this 15th century book a diagram of the high altar in the abbey, which has, I'll show you a detail of here. By the high altar, it has a representation of books that were regarded as particularly sacred as part of Gregory the Great's original mission to Canterbury. So they were kept on the high altar so that people could see them, and people believe that this gospel book that came with Augustine was one of those books that was kept on the altar. The relationship with Augustine is a very important one in terms of the ways in which the book has been used subsequently. So Augustine, having come from Rome with his monks, part of this mission of spreading Christianity within what we now call England, Augustine is regarded as the first Archbishop of Canterbury. And the book has become central to liturgies since, well, probably there's some discussion that this tradition began in the medieval period, in the Middle Ages, but that each Archbishop-elect of Canterbury, when they take their oath, the book is part of that liturgy. So you see here Justin Welby when he's being enthroned as the Archbishop of Canterbury with Dean Robert Willis, who many of you will have known from his relationship with St. Thomas. Welby kissing our book. So it's an extraordinary, for me, record of the ways in which Pope Gregory the Great in particular, but Christians were thinking about the role of art in the exploration, the teaching of the content of Christianity. It's also historically for us an extremely important book, ongoing in its connection with the position of Archbishop of Canterbury. And here, as a little teaser, to give you a sense of the scale of the book and its portability, so its scale and ability to be handled easily gives us a sense that this is a book that's written to be read and for people to have easy access to. You'll see some books in the Morgan exhibition that are enormous, that are part of the use of liturgy where various monks, for example, could sing from the book and from a distance be able to see what the text is. This is clearly a text that is able to be handled quite intimately, and so therefore the images are small and able to be interacted with. And we have in this photograph, the book was also requested by the current king to be present at his coronation, to give you a sense of the historical importance of the book, particularly within the life of England, not just the church more broadly. We have the Master of Corpus Christi processed that gospel book into Westminster Abbey for the coronation, and the woman behind him read the gospel at the coronation. And of course, she, as the next Archbishop-elect, will have the opportunity in her enthronement to also interact with the gospel book. So I thought this was a particularly nice image. I hope that you enjoy it. That's about the high point, I guess, of my PowerPoint presentation for now. So moving to the image that I want to speak briefly about for the remainder of the time is this very small scene where we have Christ sitting at the center of the scene with his hands raised in what we are familiar with as a gesture of blessing, holding the bread with the cup placed very prominently at the center of the table. And this looks fairly straightforward. It doesn't seem to be a very complex image. It could be understood as an abbreviation of the Last Supper scene on a miniature page here, where not all of the apostles, 12, are going to fit around the table, and each of the small scenes are abbreviated representations of bigger stories, so that a viewer can immediately recognize the entry to Jerusalem, Jesus on a horse, or a donkey, I should say, So the idea is to abbreviate the narrative details to the central key figures, and so we have an abbreviation, if you like, of the Last Supper. But it's not just about the Last Supper, I think. I would argue the other very interesting thing about this very apparently humble miniature is that it's quite radical at this point in the way that the artist has chosen to represent Jesus in that position at the center, with that hand gesture in proximity to the bread and the cup, so that you have this direct central line, which is a central line that runs down. If I go back to the page, like down the central axis of the page. Christ is represented here as a focus. The other very important thing about this scene is that among all of the miniatures on the page, so we have 12 miniature episodes, this is the only episode where Christ is presented completely frontally to the viewer, which may not seem to be particularly radical, but it seems to me to be very important that that's the choice as where the image is shown and how Christ is presented to the viewer facing them. His eyes seem to be slightly raised up or looking out of the image, but the interesting thing about that is that he's engaging out of the image rather than within it. So it provides an opportunity for whoever's looking at the page to feel engaged themselves or to have an entry point into the image. In all of the other cases, you'll see intently focused towards the gates of Jerusalem, looking down here, looking at Judas at the moment of the kiss, looking down at the feet, raising Lazarus, and then in the next bottom half of the, should I touch the screen to take those icons off? Is that, there we go. In the bottom part here, again, always the eye line is contained within the scene. So in terms of the full page itself, the fact that he's presented frontally to us at the top of the whole cycle seems to me to allow that scene to provide a point of connection, and also to provide the point where we might consider not just that this is one episode in a cycle of historical scenes from his life, but what the artist is doing is trying to say something about the broader significance of that particular event. So in terms of the way that the scene is structured itself, this isn't just about the Last Supper relative to all of the other scenes on the page in terms of a cycle of events leading up to Christ's death. But this is recognizable to someone as Christ occupying the gestures and with the table set in a way that reminds us of the Eucharist, and the role, therefore, that the apostles have in providing a link for us in thinking about the role of the priest and our own connection in receipt of the Eucharist as part of the priest as the representative of Christ. The structure of the scene is interesting in terms of ancient models of meal scenes. We tend to think, or you may read about the fact that the representation of meal scenes in the earliest Christianity is very popular, and often people refer to or label scenes such as this as early representations of the Last Supper. And they're not. They are representations of meal scenes, often celebrated at the site of the graves of the deceased, the sharing of meals, and giving us an insight of basic dining practices within the Roman world, where people would be seated around a circular table where they would recline rather than sit up at a table. So that was a standard way of engaging both in eating and dining. And then sometimes in the central part of the table, you might have entertainment put on for your guests. But reclining, particularly on one elbow, was a standard posture for the meals. And you'll see some gestures, people with elbows on the table leaning forward into the table, which is a little clearer in this example, which is a smaller structure that they're seated around, but you see the bread that they are sharing at the center that's damaged now, but their hands leaning in as part of this discursive element of eating and dining together. So I highlight those gestures because when we come back to look at the miniature again, you'll see some resonance with what is an established visual language, if you like, for dining that becomes integral to thinking about how to represent both the Last Supper as well as to think about the Eucharist and its meaning. And the standard way, really, up until the 6th century, so contemporary with our Gospel book, is to show Christ seated at the head. The host would be at the head of the table, was on the left here, as we see Christ, and the apostles here. This is a very common format for the representation of the Last Supper scene, with Christ reclining. You see he has the gesture of blessing here, the food in the middle of the table, and the apostles gathered around him. This is the common format that we have. So the Last Supper as a subject is very rare before the 6th century, and when it does appear, it's very clear in this format. And that is very different from what we have in this context in the Gospel book, where Christ has been moved, as I said before, to the center, as we would know from the celebration of the Eucharist. It seems there is an influence on liturgical practice at this point on the way that the image is imagined. So the Last Supper, as I said before, is part of that narrative of Christ's life, but there's a different level of interpretation that's happening here with some little tweaks with the image as to where Christ is located and to what he's doing specifically. So there's some of these same gestures that I mentioned before of the apostles leaning forward. That's already a standard way of thinking about the meal, was a discursive and happy interactive process of eating and dining. And that animation, if you like, still remains. But the model of Christ here has become different as the central figure, with some of the other apostles you'll see on the right emulating the same gesture that he is occupying. And the structure of the table itself is interesting from what we know archaeologically of marble tabletops that are found in a variety of different archaeological contexts in the 5th and 6th centuries in churches and monasteries of this, what we call sigma-shaped tabletop, which is, I think, clearly what we have in the miniature. Again, helping us to transition a little from Last Supper according to contemporary meal practices to Last Supper as institution of Eucharist, and insertion now both of the format of the table as well as items on the table that begin to help us mentally think about what the Last Supper is important for, not only as an episode that happened in the past in the life of Christ, but in terms of the institution of the Eucharist, the ways in which that event has different significance going forward in our current situation, and of course future terms in terms of how we think about salvation and the availability of that to Christians. So this is the location of our central scene. As you see, I think you can question me and say you don't believe that, but for me, having looked at this page and thought about why is the artist making certain changes in this way and how does that affect the viewer, for me that Last Supper scene then takes a different significance in the context of the page, and the page itself then becomes slightly different in terms of its significance. And I want to finish by saying a few things about that. So often the page is discussed as one of the earliest and most rich visual representations of part of the cycle of the Passion of Christ, and it certainly is. And there's a lot of discussion about, because, as I mentioned at the outset, the drawings are quite fine in their pen outlines and just simple colour washes rather than gold or expensive pigments that are used, that because the book was portable and maybe used as part of instruction, that the images are not represented or not fulfilled by the greatest artist, and that they're really just for instruction. They don't necessarily have any other greater importance, as you might see from those manuscripts at the Morgan. They're not dazzling and extraordinary in their expensive pigments and complexity of iconography. But I think that undersells what is quite an important statement within the page here itself. And I think from having a closer look at it, the border is one clue in helping us to think about the ways in which that page itself is not just a simple sort of sketch of some of the high points of the life of Christ and to help us remember them and that process of reflection, but also saying something more important theologically about the significance of that cycle. And you'll see what seems to be a fairly simple border is emulating the material of marble. And I'll show you an image just in a moment of some contemporary marble. The frame is emulating a very precious material at this period, a material that speaks to monumentality and wealth and opulence and the designation of something as quite extraordinary. And also these tiny little angular lines across the marble are indicating the idea in a very simple way of the adornment of marble. We often find sometimes in representations of columns or other objects in the Roman period of marble being wrapped with ribbons or with garlands. And this is what we have in very simple but schematic terms of that idea that the marble is being is adorned with ribbons. So there's something very important here about the choice of the frame. This is an example more elaborately of the way that marble was used by Romans to assert this point of monumentality, of grandeur and of importance. And in a domestic context, this is much earlier, but a household shrine from Pompeii, where the representation of these household deities has a very opulent, monumental architectural frame with garland ribbons as part of the framing structure of these household deities. So I think our page is, in very simple but quite profound terms, saying something important about the significance broader theologically of these episodes from the life of Christ, and providing us as an entry point through this scene of the Last Supper slash earlier inference of the Eucharist, a means by which we enter this page to think personally about our own role, or imagining whether we connect with the apostles in that Last Supper scene or other scenes, that we have an entry point to consider and reflect upon the theological significance of these stories that happened in the past, but have an ongoing resonance for our life in the contemporary moment, and also thinking about the future moment. So there's a collapsing of time there of these points in Christ's life, the significance of what happened in that life, and the significance for us in terms of our own lives here and now, but in terms of our eternal salvation, what happens in the future. So Christ here, I think, in this early image becomes presented in a way that will have great influence in the ways that the Eucharist is portrayed, and continues in terms of reflection, whether it's by an Archbishop of Canterbury who actually gets to see the page up close, or individuals who can reflect on this. It seems to me a very pivotal moment in the representation of the Last Supper for the ways in which we think about the Eucharist and its institution and its place in our own lives. So, thank you.
So we have time for some questions. I have one curiosity about this thing. So you say that this particular way of representing the Eucharist starts in the 6th century, right?
That's according to what evidence survives.
Do you know if there is a reason, historical reason, or liturgical or theological reason why this happens at that time in particular?
No, I do not.
Okay. I'm curious about that because
yes,
it's a profound shift.
It is.
In the way the Eucharist is perceived and represented.
It is.
So compared to the others, the centrality of Christ and the almost hierarchic way. And you mentioned something about probably being a sign of a celebration of the Eucharist, which is more formal, with the celebrant being in the middle.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's no. There are no obvious comparison images like this to help tease out a response to that sort of question, which makes it even more unique in some respects. At this period, there are some representations of Christ administering communion to the apostles from behind a rectangular table. And there are a couple of versions where he's represented twice, so that with two figures, one turning to give wine to apostles, and the other one is in the act of administering bread. So the communion of the apostles in that sort of format. There's another example from a manuscript, also 6th century, where the apostles are lining up to receive. Christ is standing where Father Luigi is, and all of the apostles are in different modes of access to receiving from him, but there's no table. So there's an interest in communion, which is also concurrent with, in the 6th century, that is the date from which we have more securely datable liturgical objects. So silverware, and we have these that survive because of hoards or treasures that have been excavated, and they have metal maker stamps that mean that we can date them very securely. So, so around the 6th century, there is quite a lot of evidence for thinking about what is laid on the table and how are objects being used. But then the question also emerges about the shapes of the tables. And so there are a number of allied questions that haven't been treated together. And this image is quite extraordinary in the ways that it points to those allied questions and asks us to begin to think a little bit more about that.
So, do you have questions for Felicity?
Just out of curiosity, how long did it take, let's say, after the resurrection when Christianity began, for images to begin? And was there any hesitation because of the tradition of not portraying images in the Jewish faith?
Right. It's a good question. So there is no art that is clearly identifiable as Christian that survives before around 200 AD. That doesn't mean to say that Christians were not commissioning works of art, or that they weren't using objects in their daily life and investing them with particular significance, or that they weren't using particular images, like a shepherd, for instance, and investing it. But the point at which we can see that they are doing that clearly doesn't emerge until around 200. And at that point, we have a range of things from household lamps, where we know that the shepherd on the lamp is understood as Christian because he's represented with other narrative scenes, or there may be an inscription, Christos, that's quite obvious. So before that date, it's murky. The other part of your question about why, what are the reasons behind this? We don't tend to, well, traditionally the response has been that because of the second commandment, there was a blanket aversion to images, but we know that that's not actually true, and certainly not also universally true for Jewish communities. Yes. So we know that in certain times and places, what Christians now refer to as the second commandment, and forbidding idolatry, that command in locations where idolatry was a problem, then that commandment is enforced very carefully. In regions or times when it's not a problem, we find evidence of experimentation with figural imagery. So I think that the safest thing that we can say is that there is no question that some Christians, and we know this from certain Christian writers, that there was apprehension about art and its power and what it could lead to, but that for others there was a comfort around that. The other part to the question is that there is obviously some anxiety connected to idolatry, which means that we do not have any, well, there are very few three-dimensional sculptural forms. So that it's clear that as a medium, sculpture, a three-dimensional sculpture was more directly associated with idolatrous practices. And so there are a few examples. There's a Good Shepherd, a series that is in the Cleveland Museum of Art that's very famous, both for their beauty but also their rarity. So there seems to have been some caution, and it was approached in different ways.
Thank you.
Great question. Yes.
When did this technique of the what we know now as a cartoon telling of a story, I ask this because I have a copy of an early, presumably Ethiopian painting that's the Queen of Sheba. Oh. And it's the same, exactly like this.
Yes. There are connections with illustrated manuscripts of classical texts where the page is broken up into segments and divided. The segments are divided by red borders. So illustrations of Virgil's Aeneid, for example. So we know that the breaking down of a story into sort of bite-sized pieces, as we might relate to a cartoon strip today, is an ancient one. There are also marble tablets, again relating to Homer's Iliad, for example, where little episodes are contained within little segments. So as a mechanism for retelling quite complex stories, and often people relate this to memory techniques, that the small abbreviated scenes were able to contain enough information for the viewer to remember the whole story. So this is an ancient technique that then Christians are exposed to, but artists are also used to working in that way. For manuscripts, there are no surviving illustrated Christian manuscripts before the 6th century. There are some fragments of papyri that might indicate that images are utilized alongside text and so forth. But from the 6th century, we have 4 Christian books that have illustrations. So the other big there are some big questions for anyone interested in the earliest Christian art. One is, when does it appear, and why is there no Christian art before then? And the other is, what came first, the chicken or the egg, the illustrated book or the art in other contexts? So were there texts circulating that had some images of this abbreviated kind, and that inspired people to think about how to represent other scenes? We're not really sure.
This is very quick. Very quick. Could you tell us what each one is? You told us what some is.
Oh, yes.
Jerusalem. I couldn't use that.
And they're not in order, and they're not from one gospel book, which is also this was where I hesitate to use this term illustration, which we use without thinking. These aren't necessarily illustrations in that, this happened in this text and this is what we're going to do. So it's a kind of compilation. But we have entry to Jerusalem, Last Supper, the Gethsemane, raising of Lazarus, the foot washing, betrayal of Judas with a kiss, the arrest of Christ. He's being... this is also very important because we don't have many representations of violence being enacted upon Jesus before this time. So here's someone's drawing a knife and he's being arrested. Appearance before Caiaphas. Also being beaten up here in the arrest. This one, he's leaving Pilate, who's washing his hands, and then he's being led to his crucifixion, Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Felicity. This is a fascinating program, so I'm sure you agree with me, and a very, very good start for a series on seeing the Eucharist. Really how people have seen the Eucharist from the beginning, and again, that kind of structure is I find fascinating.
Yes.
When I saw the text, because this became like normative afterwards in terms of representation of the Eucharist.
Right.
So there is a lot of thinking that can come into this. So
Yes, it's more important than it seems, because I think because of the medium and it's sort of sketchy, but it's actually holding a lot of
we are so
change.
accustomed to see it that we don't appreciate the novelty of it.
That's
and
true.
then that's something that really I think stays with me powerfully about this. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I'm sure you did, and express our appreciation.
Thanks. Thanks. I know you have to run. I know.
Are you staying
Yes.
from us? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see you at the end of the
Okay.
next one. Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Oh, thank you. I hope that was okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want me to do anything?
But I'll take the next.
Oh, yes, of course.